What happens when a TV broadcast goes beyond entertainment and burrows into your brain? British television has a habit of creating shows that weren't just creepy, they were unforgettable nightmares in disguise. Viewers tuned in for drama, only to leave with images that stuck for decades. And here's the kicker. Many of these programs aired once, then vanished into legend. But which ones left scars that still linger in pop culture shadows? Let's dive into 12 chilling examples. The Signalman, 1976. It begins with a simple railway tunnel and ends with one of the most unsettling finales in British television. Adapted from Charles Dickens' short story, The Signalman aired as part of the BBC's Ghost Story for Christmas tradition, and it quickly became one of the crown jewels of televised horror. The premise seems modest. A lonely railway worker, isolated by long hours and his haunting surroundings, confides in a traveler about strange apparitions, warning of disasters on the tracks. But here's what made it terrifying. The production leaned into atmosphere over spectacle. The endless echo of trains, the fog rolling through the countryside, and the weary face of Denholm Elliot as the signalman turned everyday routine into unbearable tension. Audiences expecting a quaint period drama got something much darker. The BBC had a reputation for slow-burn storytelling, and this one simmered with dread until its chilling conclusion. Viewers reported being left cold by the eerie inevitability of the ending, which hinted at fate, doom, and forces well beyond human control. What really cemented the signalman's legacy was how ordinary it felt at first. Nothing supernatural leaps from the screen, no gimmicky jump scares break the mood. Instead, the horror grows steadily, as if time itself is conspiring against the characters. By the final minutes, when the ghost's warning collides with grim reality, the entire story crashes into a revelation you cannot unsee. For many who caught it in 1976, The Signalman was more than a Christmas tale. It was proof that fear doesn't need monsters, it just needs a tunnel, a whistle, and the creeping certainty that something terrible is waiting around the bend. Penda's Fen, 1974. Imagine tuning into a drama and realizing you're not just watching a story, you're watching a national identity unravel. Penda's Fen aired once as part of the Play for Today series, and it still stands as one of the strangest, most disorienting pieces of television Britain ever produced. On the surface, it follows Stephen, a teenager wrestling with his place in a rural village. But almost immediately, reality starts cracking. He sees visions of angels, demons, and even the ghost of England's last pagan king, Penda. Each encounter pushes him further into a surreal meditation on tradition, authority, and personal awakening. This wasn't the kind of show that gave you tidy answers. Instead, it drenched you in a dreamlike atmosphere where every field and hedgerow seemed to whisper secrets. The landscapes of the Malvern Hills became characters in their own right, rolling green countryside transformed into something uncanny and threatening. When it aired, audiences didn't know what to make of it. Was it horror? Was it political allegory? Was it both? Teachers complained that it was too confusing for young viewers, while critics hailed it as a bold, unsettling masterpiece. Its rarity only added to the myth, because for decades it wasn't shown again, leaving those who saw it wondering if they had imagined the entire thing. What makes Penda's Fen scary isn't a ghost leaping from the shadows. It's the idea that the ground beneath your feet, the history of your country, and the culture you thought you knew might not be what they seem. It strips away certainty and leaves you standing in a landscape where past and present blur together into something you can't quite define. To this day, Penda's Fen is cited as folk horror television at its most audacious. It's not just creepy, it's unsettling on a level that gnaws at how you see the world. And that's a kind of fear you can't just switch off when the credits roll. Archer's Goon, 1992. Children's television isn't supposed to feel like a fever dream, but Archer's Goon managed exactly that. Broadcast by the BBC in the early 90s and adapted from Diana Wynne Jones's novel, this 6-part series looked harmless at first. But for the kids who watched it, the experience was anything but gentle. The story begins with a family's life turned upside down, when a hulking figure called the Goon shows up demanding payment of mysterious words. That's right, words, not money. The Goon explains that 7 wizards secretly control the town, and they've each divided its power among themselves. From there, things spiral into a bizarre mixture of magical intrigue, political satire, and unnerving menace. What made Archer's Goon scary wasn't blood or monsters. It was the way ordinary life suddenly felt, hijacked by forces beyond comprehension. The Goon himself, portrayed by actor Anthony Head, was both comic and terrifying. He could fill a room with strange energy, leaving viewers uneasy even when he wasn't being overtly threatening. The imagery, the weird humor, and the slow creep of paranoia turned what should have been a children's fantasy into something that scarred imaginations. Many adults who saw it as children recall being baffled, fascinated, and deeply unsettled. The town felt claustrophobic, the characters unpredictable, and the plot so strange it left lasting impressions. It wasn't a show you could easily forget, because it didn't behave like other children's dramas of its time. Archer's Goon proved that kids' TV could flirt with real darkness, serving up a strange cocktail of wonder and dread. For many, it became the kind of memory you look back on and ask yourself, did that really air on children's television? Yes, it did. And it was as bizarrely chilling as you remember. The Singing Ringing Tree, 1964. Sometimes the scariest shows don't even start as British productions, but the BBC made sure this fairy tale from abroad became childhood nightmare fuel. The Singing Ringing Tree was originally an East German film from 1957, later bought by the BBC, dubbed in English, and broadcast in 1964. It looked like a children's fantasy, but what unfolded on screen was surreal and unnerving enough to terrify an entire generation. The tale follows a princess cursed with arrogance and selfishness. She's given a quest involving a magical tree that only rings when she finds true love. Along the way, she encounters a dwarf who manipulates her fate, animals transformed by spells, and a landscape that feels more like a dream gone wrong than a fairy tale kingdom. What unsettled British audiences wasn't just the story, it was the presentation. The dubbing was stiff, the color palette was strange and otherworldly, and the pacing was hypnotic in the most uncomfortable way. The dwarf, with his eerie smile and odd movements, became an icon of childhood terror. For many viewers, this wasn't a lesson in morality. It was pure nightmare fuel dressed up as entertainment. Parents complained that the show was far too disturbing for children, yet kids couldn't look away. Playground conversations after its broadcast proved how deeply it lodged itself in young imaginations. Some even recalled being afraid of trees or dwarfs for years afterward. The Singing Ringing Tree showed that horror doesn't always come from intention. Sometimes cultural differences, odd visuals, and uncanny performances combine into something that bypasses reason and lodges directly in the subconscious. To this day, those who saw it remember not the lessons of the tale, but the unsettling feeling that fairy tales were never meant to look like this. Whistle, and I'll Come to You, 1968. One man on a lonely beach. That's all it took to create one of the most terrifying hours in British television. Whistle and I'll Come to You was first broadcast in 1968 as part of the BBC's omnibus arts strand, but what it delivered was far from academic. Instead, it was a masterclass in minimal, creeping horror. Adapted from M.R. James's short story, the plot follows Professor Parkins, a skeptical academic who takes a seaside holiday. While exploring, he discovers a whistle buried near a Templar grave. Of course, he blows it. From that moment on, something begins to follow him. Shadows in the dunes, a presence in his room, whispers carried by the wind. Michael Hordern's performance as Parkins elevated the story to something unforgettable. His nervous mannerisms, awkward laughter, and unraveling composure turned a rationale. Man into a bundle of terror before our eyes. The camera work, stark and minimal, let empty landscapes do the haunting. And then came the infamous bedsheet sequence where a shape seems to rise from the linens themselves that sent viewers into pure panic. The impact was immediate. Whistle and I'll Come to You became the blueprint for the BBC's ghost story for Christmas tradition that followed. But even among those later entries, this one remains the scariest. Its simplicity is its strength. No elaborate effects, no blood, just the suggestion of something ancient and relentless closing in. Viewers never forgot it. Decades later, critics still rank it among the most unnerving ghost stories ever filmed. It proved that terror could be summoned with almost nothing, just a beach, a whistle, and the realization that once you invite something in, it may never let you go. Armchair Thriller, 1978 to 1980. It wasn't billed as horror, but one episode left audiences peeking through their fingers. Armchair Thriller was an anthology series that ran on ITV, mixing crime, suspense, and occasionally full-blown terror. Out of its many stories, one stood above the rest as a national talking point. Quiet as a Nun. The setup alone was chilling. A journalist investigates the mysterious death of a nun at a convent school. The deeper she digs, the stranger the atmosphere becomes. Murmurs of corruption, whispers of secrets, and finally, the infamous Black Nun sequence one of the most terrifying moments ever broadcast on British television. The cloaked figure in the tower, slowly turning toward the camera, seared itself into viewers' memories. Children who tuned in by accident were left sleepless for weeks. Adults admitted that the eerie convent and its oppressive silence unnerved them more than any horror film. The genius of Armchair Thriller was that it didn't rely on elaborate effects or gore. It trapped you in psychological unease, the sort that builds until a single shadow makes your heart skip. Critics praised the series for its boldness, though some argued that certain episodes, including Quiet as a Nun, might have gone too far for mainstream television. ITV didn't repeat it often, perhaps realizing that lightning had struck once and didn't need to strike again. Today, Armchair Thriller has cult status. Clips of the Black Nun scene circulate online as proof of how television can burn fear directly into the national consciousness. It's a reminder that horror doesn't always announce itself. It sometimes sneaks into a show you thought was just another mystery. Tales of the Unexpected, 1970s to 80s. You sat down expecting a clever twist. What you got was a dose of dread you didn't bargain for. Tales of the Unexpected, hosted by the unmistakable Roald Dahl in its early days, was a stylish anthology series that quickly became a staple of British weekend television. While it wasn't horror in every episode, when it leaned into darkness, it delivered shocks that rivaled anything cinema had to offer. The genius of the show lay in its unpredictability. Each episode was self-contained, so you never knew what was coming. A story might begin as light drama, then twist into something grotesque or disturbing. Classic tales like Lamb to the Slaughter, where a woman cleverly disposes of a crime weapon, blurred the line between clever irony and chilling horror. For many viewers, it was the performances that made the show unforgettable. Talented British actors elevated simple setups into tense morality plays. Add in minimalist sets, moody music, and Dahl's introductions, and the result felt like being let in on a secret you weren't meant to know. The most unsettling episodes often didn't end with justice or resolution. Instead, they left viewers with a bitter aftertaste, a sense that fate was cruel and people darker than we like to admit. That ambiguity, paired with shocking reveals, made the series stick. Though remembered now for its style and clever twists, Tales of the Unexpected also stands as a bridge between cozy anthology television and the more unnerving psychological thrillers that followed. It proved that horror didn't always need shadows or spirits. It could live in irony, cruelty, and the nasty little tricks of human nature. No, 73. The Curse of the Wolf, 1980s. Here's the strange part. This was meant to be children's Saturday morning fun. No, 73 was a lively kids' variety show, full of comedy skits, music, and games. But one Halloween special, The Curse of the Wolf, took things in a direction that still baffles those who saw it. Instead of lighthearted silliness, viewers were dropped into a gothic storyline involving curses, transformations, and a creeping sense of dread. Costumes were eerie rather than funny. The set design leaned heavily into candlelit spookiness, and the narrative unfolded with a seriousness that caught children off guard. For many, it felt like stumbling into a horror film by accident. The special's werewolf theme was handled with a commitment to atmosphere. Dark corridors, ominous howls, and a growing tension between the characters created moments of genuine unease. Kids who tuned in expecting laughs found themselves glued to the screen, unsure whether they were supposed to be entertained or terrified. Parents later complained that the episode had gone too far, and the show quickly returned to its lighter tone. But the damage, or perhaps the magic, was already done. The Curse of the Wolf became playground legend, whispered about in the same breath as ghost stories told after dark. Looking back, it's almost unbelievable that such a grim story aired in the middle of a program meant for children's weekend entertainment. But that's exactly what makes it memorable. It's a rare example of how television can slip into the uncanny without warning, and for those who experienced it, number 73 was never quite the same again. Play for today. Robin Redbreast, 1970. Before folk horror became fashionable, Robin Redbreast delivered a story that rattled anyone who stumbled across it. Broadcast in 1970 as part of the BBC's Play for Today series, it looked like a rural drama at first glance. But what unfolded was far darker. The story follows Nora, a woman who moves to the countryside after a difficult breakup. She hopes for peace, but instead finds herself surrounded by villagers who seem unnervingly interested in her personal life. At first, it's subtle, their questions, their watchful stares, their insistence on tradition. But soon, she discovers she's at the center of something much more sinister. What terrified viewers wasn't just the story itself, but the creeping realization that the village was a trap. The landscape, the rituals, even the smiles of the locals carried an undertone of menace. The climax revealed a shocking twist that tied her fate to ancient customs, turning a quiet country setting into a nightmare of control and inevitability. Critics later compared Robin Redbreast to The Wicker Man for its themes of rural isolation and hidden ritual, but it predated that famous film, making it one of the earliest televised examples of British folk horror. For many who watched it, the power of Robin Redbreast lay in its plausibility. There were no ghosts or monsters, just ordinary people hiding extraordinary secrets. It blurred the line between drama and horror so well that decades later, it's still remembered as one of the most unsettling broadcasts the BBC ever dared to show. Lost Hearts, 1973. Two ghostly children, an eerie country house, and an organ tune that chills the spine. Lost Hearts, adapted from M.R. James's short story, aired in 1973 as part of the BBC's Ghost Story for Christmas series. For many, it's one of the most haunting entries in that tradition. The tale begins with a young orphan sent to live with his wealthy cousin in a grand but unsettling mansion. At first, it seems like a stroke of fortune, but strange visions soon follow. Pale, spectral children with hollow eyes and clawed fingers. They don't speak, but their presence carries a dreadful warning. What made Lost Hearts so effective was its use of music. The ghosts play a hurdy-gurdy, filling the soundtrack with a tune so eerie it clings to your nerves. The combination of childlike innocence and otherworldly menace created a dissonance that audiences found deeply disturbing. Critics praised the adaptation for staying faithful to James's talent for quiet terror. Nothing is overdone, just a slow drip of unease that builds to a conclusion, as inevitable as it is horrifying. For children watching at the time, it was nightmare fuel of the highest order. Adults admitted it unnerved them too. The image of those ghostly figures staring through the window became one of the BBC's most iconic horror moments. Lost Hearts proved that sometimes the simplest ingredients, a mansion, a child, a tune, can create television that echoes in the imagination for decades. Moondial, 1988. When the BBC made Moondial, they called it children's drama. But for the kids who tuned in, it felt more like a curse. Broadcast in 1988, this 6-part series followed a young girl named Minty who discovers a sundial with the power to transport her through time. What she finds isn't whimsical adventure, it's ghosts. Minty meets two children from the past, both bound by tragedy: Tom, a servant boy, and Sarah, a girl mistreated and locked away because of her appearance. As Minty tries to help them, she becomes tangled in their haunting world, where suffering echoes across centuries. What set Moondial apart was its refusal to soften the edges for its young audience. The imagery was stark and often unsettling. The mansion's shadowed corridors, the oppressive gardens, and the sense of history pressing down created an atmosphere closer to adult ghost stories than children's programming. Viewers remember being both entranced and unnerved. It wasn't just a story about helping lost children. It was about confronting grief, injustice, and the weight of time itself. For many young viewers, it was their first encounter with a story that felt bigger, heavier, and scarier than they were prepared for. Decades later, Moondial has a cult following. Adults revisit it and marvel at how daring it was to give children such bleak and atmospheric television. It proved that even so-called family programming could be haunting in ways that stick for a lifetime. Schalcken the Painter, 1979. Art and horror collided in one of the strangest and most atmospheric broadcasts the BBC ever aired. Schalcken the Painter, shown in 1979, adapted a Sheridan Le Fanu tale and presented it with the visual style of a gallery come to life. It wasn't just a drama, it was like stepping into a haunted painting. The story centers on the Dutch painter Godfried Schalcken, who becomes obsessed with his career and wealth. In pursuit of success, he allows the woman he loves to be married off to a mysterious, sinister figure. When she reappears later, pale and broken, it becomes clear that Schalcken's ambition has doomed them both. What made this production terrifying wasn't overt horror, but atmosphere. The BBC recreated the lighting of Dutch master paintings, bathing every frame in flickering candlelight and deep shadow. The result was claustrophobic, eerie, and unforgettable. For viewers in 1979, Schalcken the Painter was unlike anything they had seen before. Its slow pace, painterly visuals, and growing sense of dread made it feel less like television and more like stepping into a nightmare canvas. The BBC only aired it once, adding to its legend. Those who saw it remembered the oppressive atmosphere, the haunting imagery, and the way it made ambition itself feel like a curse. Today, it's a hidden gem of British horror television, an artwork, and a nightmare rolled into one. So, there you have it. 12 shows that prove British television didn't just flirt with fear, it mastered it. Some aired once and vanished, others survived in memory, but all left behind images you can't shake. Which of these legends would you dare to revisit? Drop your pick in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more journeys into the eerie corners of film and television. After all, the scariest part of TV history is how much of it still lingers in the dark.